Good evening and welcome. Bonsoir et bienvenue. My name is Ralston King. I am a trustee of the Ottawa Public Library Board and City Councillor for Rideau Rockcliffe Ward, and I'm very happy to welcome you to tonight's conversation. It is important to acknowledge that even as we gather virtually, we are on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. We honor the contributions of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, their elders, and their ancestors, and recognize their contributions, past and present. OPL's partner in the event this evening is the Ottawa International Writers Festival. Thank you to Writers Fest. You are in for a rousing discussion. Author and activist Nora Loreto is with us this evening to discuss her new book, Take Back the Fight: Organizing Feminism for the Digital Age. Nora is also the author of From Demonized to Organized: Building the New Union Movement. She is the editor of the Canadian Association of Labor Media and co-host of the podcast Sandy and Nora Talk Politics with Sandy Hudson. I hope you will join us also on Wednesday, April 28th at 7 p.m. for a discussion with author Michelle Porter about her book, Approaching Fire, as part of our Stories Indigenous Book Club. And as April is Poetry Month, we have two events to put on your radar. Seymour Main will be with us tomorrow night to discuss his latest collection of poetry, Perfume, Poems and Word Sonnets. And next Monday, Britta B will be here for a virtual performance of Rebel with a Rhythm. You can visit the Ottawa Public Library website anytime to find out about other wonderful programs and to access a gold mine of library resources, digital and physical. It is now my pleasure to introduce Sean Wilson from the Ottawa International Writers Festival to say a few words. Thank you and have a great evening. Merci and bonne soirée.
So good evening, everyone. We are broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the Writers Festival's 2021 virtual season and to thank our friends at the Ottawa Public Library for their ongoing collaboration. My name is Sean Wilson. I'm the festival's artistic director, and I want to thank all of you for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, but I know that wherever you are right now, there's an independent bookseller nearby who would be more than happy to sell you some great books. Our spring season continues into June, and it's all available online, free and on demand at writersfestival.org. If you enjoy this event or any of our virtual programming, please consider making a charitable donation. Your financial support will allow us to continue to bring you the world's most interesting authors and thinkers, even as we enter year 2 of the pandemic. Tonight, we're continuing to focus on big issues and how to be the change you are seeking in the world. And I'm thrilled to be welcoming our host tonight, Erica Eiffel. She's an economist, columnist, entrepreneur, activist, and podcaster. She's the co-owner of the intersectional business consultancy firm, Not in My Color. She's co-host of the Bad and Bitchy podcast and has a regular byline in the Hill Times and other places. I am so glad she's with us tonight to lead the conversation on taking back the fight. So let's give a warm virtual welcome to our host tonight, Erica Eiffel.
Hello, everybody. And I am super excited to introduce our author today, primarily because when I was kind of reigniting my feminist journey, she was one of the voices that I looked to. When I was starting to write, she was one of the writers that I loved reading, and her irreverent, sometimes acerbic style was just different from any woman who was writing about feminist issues at the time. And I think I just fell in love with her whole persona after the Humboldt tweet. So that gained you a fan, Nora. But I want to just introduce this wonderful book from her. It's called Take Back the Fight: and Organizing Feminism for the Digital Age. And I'm just going to read a little bit from it to help frame this conversation. Neoliberalism, anti-racist feminism, and the digital era have made it necessary for feminist activists to find different ways to organize. Much of feminist organizing has responded to this era by becoming smaller, more focused on grassroots or service-oriented organizing, and decentralized from a larger provincial or national movement. Some feminist organizing has sought to create a movement through online actions, rallies, and events, but it didn't benefit from an anchor that could connect these events with more organizational capacity. Together, this has created a patchwork of different kinds of actions with few central locations to come together and build collective power. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nora Loretto, who has written an amazing book. Um, Buy it, get it. I totally am into it. So Nora, welcome.
Hi. It's so sad to see you through a screen and not
I know.
be together. I think the last time we were together, the last time we were together we can't talk about because it got a little wild, but
Yeah.
before that, we got to see each other in Ottawa,
Yeah.
just at a Sandy and Nora Life show, and it has been really difficult to talk about the themes in the book through screens because I kind of
Yeah.
write against that.
Well, yeah, I know, but okay, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the things, so just to set the occasion, Nora and Sandy Hudson have a podcast. It's called Sandy and Nora Talk Politics. Listen to it. It is one of the few feminist media, like intersectional feminist media we have in this country. And you were talking about organizing, and you were talking about how organizing was so central to the things that we take for granted: healthcare, abortion. You talk about abortion rights in this book. Um, Maternity leave is another one. And there was another one that escaped my mind just a sec. But the point is, what you said was, we don't know how to organize anymore, that we've lost this this generational knowledge that's usually passed down through movement building, and we've lost that, and that's allowed this space to be taken up by more right-wing actors. And I remember hearing that and thinking, so how do we do that? You know what I mean? So I'm glad you wrote this book because I feel like it's answered part of that question. So I'm going to start out by talking about this, like, what is the state of feminism today? No, let me let you talk. I'm talking. Okay.
No.
I'm talking.
Yeah, so feminism is in a really interesting time. It's a very interesting moment in kind of consciousness around I don't know, understanding how patriarchy is a form of oppression that impacts everybody and it impacts everyone in different ways and in similar ways. And actually, I just wrote this article for Chatelaine, and in it I say feminism has never been more popular. And the editor was like, "Can you back that up? Are you sure? Like, how do you know that?" And I thought, how do I know that? And it's the answer is actually kind of obvious. It's so popular that the right wing has no problem calling themselves feminists, right? There's anti-abortion feminists or whatever. I talk about some in the book, and people can kind of probably think of, the Rona Ambroses of the world who come out of the Real Women of Canada, right? And are actually using the language of empowerment to have a massively de-empowering movement. And then, of course, there's celebrities who have embraced the term, and we have a prime minister who's embracing the term, right? The term should never have gotten so I don't know, accessible to someone in such a position of power that he could stand up and say, "I'm a feminist." It's his literal first act of being prime minister. And so we've got this incredible moment where if you stop people on the street and say, "Are you a feminist? Do you believe in whatever?" List the feminist demands that might come to your mind first. You're going to find it difficult to find someone who would look you in the eye and say, "No, I'm not a feminist." Right? Most people are like, "Yeah, of course I am." And then what we actually then argue about or disagree over are the the strategies to then, achieve liberation. And I'm sure that's what we're going to be probably talking a lot about tonight. But at the same time, there is not much of a movement. And I got an argument actually about this tonight with someone who's a longtime feminist activist, specifically in the childcare movement. It's like, what is the state of our movements right now? And it's not just feminism, it's the state of the left generally. But our movements are in decline. What does that mean? What it means that there are fewer organizations that people can get involved in. And I don't mean not for profits. I mean like, just groupings of people doing things. There are fewer of them. You referenced this in the introduction, that a lot of activism has had to look very local and very grassroots, which is good. That's a positive development, but there's a limit to that if that's the only kind of organizing we have. And that limit is the community bounds in which you operate, or sometimes grassroots organizing doesn't get outside of friendships or networks that are already existing. There's a lot of organizing as well as identity-based, which is really critical. But identity-based organizing has to find other ways to link up with other identities, or else people become too isolated to be able to make the kind of noise that's necessary to make change. And so with the feminist movement, there really isn't one, right? There are people who do feminist work. There are organizations that do what they can on different issues that we would understand to be feminist issues. And there are frontline service workers who are like right this minute, like trying to find someone a place to live, trying to find someone access to healthcare, trying to find someone access to a meal. And that kind of work is become the lion's share, I think, of what we understand popularly to be the feminist movement, like the frontline shelter workers, the frontline service providers. And when I say that there's no movement, it doesn't mean to say that that work's not happening and that work isn't absolutely critical, but it's in that service work that there's not much space left for the political work because everyone's completely overburdened. And so then the flip side of that is you have a lot of people who are expressing the desire to get involved in, well, let me get involved. Let me do something. You're like, okay, what? What are we going to do?
Yeah.
And that is really difficult. That is really difficult. And it was never so unclear what we need to do. And that is the result of 30 years of neoliberal economic and political policies that have completely transformed how we understand society. And it's completely transformed how we understand social power.
So let's pick up from that neoliberalism, because I think I can count on my hands how many times you use patriarchy or patriarchal, but the number of times you've used neoliberalism in this book far outstrips the number of times you even said misogyny in this book, right? So I feel like there's some themes going on here, and this is one of them. I think what was so good about this is that it didn't start out with what is feminism, right? It started out with what is sold as feminism and why is it sold that way, right? So you just talked about feminism being so accessible. I was thinking of Taylor Swift, and this is why for a long time I didn't like Taylor Swift, is because she's like, I'm a feminist. I believe that men and women should be equal. And I'm like, this is where we're starting off with. Like, granted, Taylor Swift was probably like 18 at the time. Fine. Okay. Like, I don't know. Okay. Like she was a kid. Like, you can't put that on her. But at the same time, it's been used so much for branding. And that's why it's become, so to answer that editor's question, it's like, because it's literal branding now.
Yeah.
It's marketing now. And one of the reasons is because it's lost its teeth. And it's no longer about challenging power and established social constructs. It's really about, well, I'm a good person because I believe that men and women are just equal. And you're just like, no, there are these oppressive systems that were, established from when Canada became a country and before. These systems are colonialist, they're racist, they are based on the premise of white supremacy, within which patriarchy is a feature, not a bug. So how are we going to actually break down those systems
Mhm.
and actually liberate women? And when I was reading this, I was thinking, wow, all of these other movements. So I don't know more, missing and murdered, Black Lives Matter, no one is illegal, all of these movements, women, either women or queer based, right? Um, and it just seems that all of that feminism has lost these people to these sort of, outside, not outside as in they're not important, but outside to feminism. So around like feminism, since they have such a female presence there. And what I was thinking was, isn't it a shame that feminism itself seems to be in this like disarray? And then coming up from feminism, or what feminism should be able to like take from those movements, is some of those strategies, some of those people, in building that network. So all this to say, there's a question here. Back to neoliberalism, what you say is that neoliberalism, the purpose of neoliberalism is to break down communities, isolate people by championing rabid individualism, resulting in people turning to the markets for solutions instead of building collective solutions. And so, can you talk a little bit about the community building aspect of social movement building, why it's so important, and why it's different from neoliberalism's replacement, which is networking? Like,
Right.
how are those two things different? And in terms of building movements?
Mm. I will answer that. I want to go back to what you were saying before you asked the question, because you were on a very interesting line of thought. When I was first thinking about this book, and I write about this in the book, I don't come from being kind of like, I would say in French, formed in the feminist movement, right? I come from it from being actually in the student movement, which is another one of these feminist adjacent movements, right? There's obviously feminist organizing within it. It's obviously got a feminist perspective to an extent, but I didn't come from the feminist movement. And when I was talking to Judy Rebick, who is a long-time known feminist activist and was there from the start of the second wave of the movement, and is obviously still very active today. I was asking her, what happened in the 1990s, and in the way that she saw um, feminist leadership taking roles in other movements. And she specifically mentioned globalization, anti-globalization movements, and climate justice. That was a victory of the feminist movement, was to create these leaders to then go out to other movements and lead those movements. And it was very interesting that she was saying this to me, and I said, okay, yeah, but what about the feminist movement then, right? What then happens to this group? Who's left, right? Who looks at everything that's happening today and says, okay, there's migrant justice, there's Black Lives Matter, there's Indigenous justice and decolonization, and there's any number of issues, and I'm going to focus on women's issues. And she said to me, there's no like essentializing feature of being a woman, which then gets us to the fundamental like problematized question of the feminist movement that emerged in the 1980s and then continued. Of course, Kimberly Crenshaw gave us language for this and talking about intersectionality, but is there anything that unites women through their womanhood that then we can build a movement around, or is even that on its own a false place to start? And I was very challenged by this, right? I was like, okay, like we know that there's obviously certain elements of how society and patriarchy exists, that there are features of patriarchy that all women are going to find themselves statistically in certain positions. And then of course, because of intersectionality, that will be tiered in different ways depending on who you are. But when you start to then create other movements that then try to get at feminism through that adjacent kind of perspective, you still need a feminist movement to be able to then take up the migrant justice in the perspective of migrant women workers, right? Or looking at Black Lives Matter and take up the struggle, specifically looking at how misogynoir exists without across society. And so that was what I was really trying to imagine. It's like, yeah, so we are in this era where our politics collectively have advanced, like the analysis has advanced. A lot of men have kind of finally gotten a little bit out of the way, although we can talk about that too, because that hasn't happened enough. Sorry, guys. Um, and yet we find ourselves in this moment where there isn't this anchoring kind of force that can help us navigate this issue. So the question that you asked, this why is community building so important? I like to think of it as, the most popular narratives around social justice activism is you eventually burn yourself out, right? Is that you eventually, it's just like you just go so hard and then it's just you burn yourself out. And that is such a modern era concept, that there are so few people doing the work, that there's so few opportunities to share tasks, that you personally will put yourself into the machine and get ground up by the machine and go, oh my God, I'm burnt out. And that's not how social movement change happens. That's why we need our communities. And communities are locations where, you can bring your kid to a meeting and your kid might disappear for an hour because you know that your kid's been taken by someone who you know well enough. And you're like, yeah, I'm going to be participating in this meeting and my kid's gone for an hour. And then all of a sudden they know you're organizing friends. And then all of a sudden, you're in struggle together and you know which each other's strengths and their weaknesses, and you're able to organize around, okay, yeah, you maybe you're not the best person for this, but we know that you would be the best person for that. And then that person goes, well, you also, you actually start to build these kinds of like this organism that feeds off of itself. And and then that's where you build the structures that are critical, like accountability, like some kind of democratic decision making, transparency with how things are being operated for whoever you decide your audience is. And then the critical thing, the strength, the interpersonal bonds that give you the strength, whether or not you're friends with everyone. I don't think people need to be friends. I actually think that's important too. You don't have to be friends with everybody, but you know that you have a community of people who will get your back and you will get other people's backs as the heat gets turned up on your movement. And when you think about, let's say, the fight for childcare, like the liberals are going to come up with some schemy piece of garbage idea for sure and how they're going to implement this. And if we don't have the ability to turn the heat up on them, and then of course have the ability to get each other's backs when the people who are turning the heat up on them get, the hammer like dropped on them, then automatically the movements fighting for that are going to be less powerful. And we do not think about movement building in that way. I think that we've lost that tradition and we imagine these things to be just decided from on high, from politicians, because childcare makes good economic sense. There's $5 billion to be made. It's like, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't matter how much money it saves. Capitalism is not efficient. The whole point of it is it's not to be efficient. So anyway.
What about networking?
Yeah, and so networking is an interesting way. Like there's this through meeting people online and building new communities. This is apparently going to replace community. And I think that there's a confusion between the two kinds of things, is that networking is a way to I think it's a way for us to figure out how to navigate oppressive structures, right? There's a way that you can come up with a network of people, and that network of people might be like the whisper network, like watch out for that guy, watch out for this job, watch out for that boss, right? And this is critical, right? That's a completely critical lifeline.
Yeah.
But it's not a movement, and it's not creating community in the same way. And networks are by their nature exclusive, right? You are an exclusive member of a specific kind of network based on a whole bunch of different factors.
Yeah.
And that's fine, right? We need that, because if I don't have a network in the media world, well, I mean, I don't. I imagine I had a network of people being able to go, avoid that person, go over here. You could be like that over here. No, I don't have that, yeah. But I hear that would be very helpful. But that in and of itself cannot take down power. That can navigate around power.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a nuance with that. Yeah. There's a lot about community in here and community building. And it's funny because now that we're in COVID and everybody's isolated, I just wonder if you know, in a way that I just wonder if it's kind of like a human need to be a part of something or a part of a community. And we've been told and taught that this is, it's better and more efficient to be this individual and not exist in this network. Or we're told that a community cannot decide things for itself. You know, that's the other part, because here's what I don't like about some, I guess this is sort of like a left response politically to neoliberalism and the forces we're talking about. But sometimes communities can do their own thing and be fine. Like, not everything requires state intervention, is my point. I
Totally.
think the police is a really good example of that. You know, not everything requires the state. And so, and especially when the state has so much power, and we're moving into this like administrative power, this bureaucratic power that has no checks and balances. They are anonymous. They can screw you over in a heartbeat. I was just talking to a friend of mine, and she was talking about how there are marginalized women who will keep powdered milk visible, just in case there's a state check, and so that the state won't take their children away.
Oh yeah.
And that's the thing. Like, I think that and this will just move into the whiteness of the feminist movement. When the whiteness of feminism does not understand that, you know, maybe we don't want to get social services involved everywhere, because you know, if you're indigenous and you talk about sterilization, you talk about McClung, one of the Fabulous Five, I believe, and her love of sterilization and how she laid the groundwork for drug policy and anti-drug policy that has put so many people of color in jail, by the way, and how, you know, the whiteness of Canada's feminist movement has been a feature of Canada's feminist movement. And so when we're talking about women, especially marginalized women, leading these other movements, I just wonder how many of us have had, because I know I have had adverse experience in feminist spaces. Okay. So you know how you're saying, I got to tell a story. Okay.
Yeah.
So you know how you're saying you came by feminism like a little bit later as an outgrowth of something else? So did I. I came to it through an outgrowth of just Blackness, like of just, you know, anti-racism work, right? So, so to me, I'm going into these feminist spaces. I remember one in particular, a bunch of second wave feminists, geez. And they were so hostile to me, to my ideas, so much so that one bullied me online. Like, that's how bad it was. And so I was like, I'm out of here. I'm not doing this work. Like, I'm not doing this work in those spaces. And so I'm not getting that either. I'm not getting that sort of organizing and movement building passed down, because they're just so damn hostile.
Yeah.
And I feel like, you know, some of the greatest movements that are happening are absent of a real feminist structure, because we're really sick of white women. Like, we
Totally.
really are, because they are absolutely hostile to us. And you talk about the NAC, so the National Action Committee for the Status of Women, and when they elected their first and only Black president, and how she was completely undermined by white women.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a question in there somewhere, but
You
carry
know,
on.
I mean, so there's so much to talk about, and it's like the history of the feminist movement in Canada, the popular history of it. is absolutely entwined with the project of colonization, right? And so, not only do you have womanhood, which, under the conservative understanding of womanhood being not what a feminist would probably accept, a white feminist would probably accept, right, in the kitchen and this kind of thing. But that's happening in the 1800s at the same time that you have radical organizing that is happening um, around the Knights of Labor. And that's the labor movement, which was also hostile towards women. And I mentioned in the book that the first local, I forget what the name of the Knights of Labor presidents were. It's like the first local taskman or something like this, ever elected, who was a woman, was an immigrant woman from London, Ontario. Um,
Oh,
and the still the hostility that she faced was like a lot. Like these are not spaces that were fair to women necessarily, but there was a radicalness around fighting at the same time as the first national organization of women was established, and that was established by the royal consort to the Governor General of Canada, Lady Aberdeen, who used to live in Quebec City, and I live like really close to a street that's named after her. So I think about her all the time, Lady Aberdeen. And so Lady Aberdeen is not working in the same way as the women who the few women, but the women who are organizing around the Knights of Labor. And in the Knights of Labor, they were able to talk about radical literature, but also talk about stuff that women had to be up on, like how to make your whites as white as possible with no bleach or whatever.
mhm.
I don't know what they used back then. I assume they had bleach. But at the same time, you also had someone like Marianne Shadd, who was publishing the Provincial Freeman and was the first woman newspaper publisher, from a first Black woman newspaper publisher in Canada. And her newspaper lasted for 10 years. And she finishes that and she goes back to the United States and becomes one of the first Black women lawyers. Not something that she achieves in Canada, which is very interesting. And, I don't know the history of her decision to go back to the United States, but, that's interesting. And so there's always been this, like, the dominant, usually tied to class, not always, but certainly in the early days tied to class, white women organizing. And then the poor women, racialized women who are outside of that, organizing themselves. And then throughout all of this, you have Indigenous women who are fighting for survival and fighting for self-determination and fighting against, basically apocalyptic levels of violence, right, coming from this ongoing colonial project. And so this is the basis, right? The famous five. I mean, you mentioned Nellie McClung and Emily Murphy, who was the daughter of Supreme Court justice and had uncles who were elected. I mean, these were not normal women. These were women who today I would probably want to throw my shoe at, right? And feminist activists wanted to throw their shoes at these women at the time too, which I think is really important to keep in mind. So fast forward, we are still existing in a world that is so clinging to white supremacy that you can see it on the left in lots of different ways. And it's these spaces. Like, first of all, we don't have many spaces, and that's a key issue, because if we don't have many spaces, then the spaces that exist are even more restricted, even more controlled, even more
Surveilled.
surveyed, for sure, and also like in the grips of white supremacy, right? Because as things get even more tight, white people, we need to hold on to the power that we have in little spaces that we have.
Right.
Right. And so that's a huge problem. And it's not as if in the 1980s that that racialized women like had their place and were in leadership positions within these organizations. But what was true was that, like, racialized women organizing in collectives within that broader umbrella of NAC and of the feminist movement were providing radical critiques. We're injecting discussions around the rights of domestic workers who come from the Caribbean and the United States, who are mostly Black, and then making sure that white feminists understood that as a feminist issue, which we're mostly successful in, because today you can actually very easily see that as being a feminist issue. There's not going to be a white woman that says, that's not a feminist issue. We have other ways. We have other ways to make things uncomfortable. Okay? So that's a huge problem. And I went to a conference once. It was like a big national organizing of feminists in 2009, and I went through the student movement. And so, like, I was like one of the few people that wasn't in gender studies or whatever the hell. And
Mhm.
it was like the most uncomfortable experience of my life. And like there was, I don't know, 20 of us who at the end when everyone's crying and hugging and stuff, and we were like, we need to get the hell out of here. And then we like formed a support group at the airport bar in Winnipeg, and then we all almost missed our flights home. I mean, that's a story for maybe another night and another book, but it was just this incredible show of whiteness of this like well-meaning, completely off key feminist organizing that was trying to probably do too much at once, because not only were they trying to organize this pan-Canadian discussion, they were also trying to bridge Quebec and the rest of Canada, which is super not easy, right? So there's a huge language divide, there's a huge cultural divide, and then there's the Indigenous feminists who were like, oh, you didn't even think about us. And we're
Mhm.
like, well, we thought about you, you're here. It was a disaster. So because of the lack of space, we don't have places to build that kind of community where you come together and hash it out and you can hold people to account. And that becomes a huge barrier to being able to make sure that white people, and I think this, like, as someone who's very obviously white and very white, like from shitty southwestern Ontario, southern Ontario, being able to be in a space with another white person and hold them to account requires me literally being in a space with them, which I'm not. Right, like
Mhm.
there just isn't those kinds of spaces where like I can do that kind of work in real life, and so I've kind of decided to do it online to the best that I can, and certainly we do that work a little bit through Sandy and Nora Talk Politics, but it's the necessity of us to be in spaces together and to not think that we can do this work online, because
Mm.
anti-racist education online has a limit, and the
Yeah.
limit is like education, right? Oh, here's all the text, here's all the theory, here's all the thing, and you can do all of that, but you're still not going to get a lot of, like, get to the core of what makes someone cling to white supremacy to the extent that they do. And that takes, like, I mean, really not actual fist hitting, but a lot of work. And I've seen it happen in the student movement. And I certainly owe a lot of my own analysis where I am today to that kind of really difficult intellectual, personal, social struggle in real life, in spaces that we need to create.
So what did you learn in the student movement um, that you feel feminists are missing at this point in the
Hmm.
digital age, especially?
I learned a lot in the student movement. The student movement was really interesting in the time that I was there because it was very contested. And so, like, there was one national federation that was like the biggest. Then there
Mhm.
was a right wing federation that offered a really good right wing foil. So there was always this kind of tension on the right, which was very
Mhm.
fun, right? Because you just could call them scabs and hacks, and that's what they were. And then you had this huge set of students who were not involved in either formally in their student union, because maybe their student union wasn't a member of this organization, or they were a member of the organization, but their issues weren't being represented, and so they didn't feel connected to it. Or you had the left wing kind of challenge to this organization, which was also really, really, really important. And
Mhm.
so I found myself in the bureaucracy of this. And in the bureaucracy of this, we always had arguments over how do we had very few arguments about how to deal with the right. That was very clear, and we went really, really hard, and we tried to fight them every place we could. We would fight them literally on campus. We'd fight them in the media. We would fight them within politicians, within backroom meetings. We would fight them every step of the way that we could. But it was the left wing attack or challenge to this organization that I think that a lot of people struggled with. And I learned very early that for a proper movement to function, those people in bureaucratic roles need to understand how to work with, listen to, be pulled by that external force, that
Mhm.
external left wing force in that case. And at the same time, looking at student issues and understanding student issues through the lens of the students who are in the most difficulty or the biggest struggles. And so,
Mhm.
not looking at averages, but instead looking at mature students who are single mothers,
Yes.
students with the highest amount of debt. And when you
Mhm.
start to imagine an average student no longer being a 20-year-old who might have a little bit of student debt, but whatever, you start imagining them as the most like oppressed members among your membership, then you can actually start to get at understanding that, oh, actually war is a student issue, the environment is a student issue, poverty is a student issue, racism is a student issue. but you always come back to that actual student issue, which is like the funding and the tuition fees and the debt and all the kind of boring stuff that is the core. So you have the core issue, and you had the peripheral issues that were all really important as well. And the key was to make sure that you balanced those, because if you went too far into a peripheral issue, no matter how important that issue was, you would lose a lot of people. But at the
Yes.
end of the day, you had to have that core understanding of who is the most effective member, and it was never the middle class white guy, even though that's usually who a lot of people understood that we were organizing towards. So that was really important. And then I also learned the power of debate, and and then what happens when debate is in decline. If you don't have a fighting movement where people are actively debating on the floors of convention, and instead everything's controlled and everything's contrived and nothing is how it looks, and you can't get ahead on any single motion, which is how we're seeing a lot of the labor movement and the NDP is operating right now, then people disengage and they hate it and they start to hate you. And then things collapse. And so that glue of actual, honest, good spirited debate is really, really at the core of how you build something that has the power to withstand external pressures. Because if you can't deal with your own internal debate, like no way in hell are you going to be able to stand up to the power of the Conservative Party, or the power of the Liberal Party, or the power of the state, or your security forces.
Well, that's a good point, and it goes back to what you were talking about with spaces, because part of what happens in those spaces are exactly what you're talking about, which then gets distilled into messaging and policy and all of the like boring paperwork that we hate but are so important to stake a position, so then you can go out there and actually communicate that in a real way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, you especially mention about how the lack of that has allowed someone like Justin Trudeau to call himself a feminist without being really, without doing anything, And so, which like, look, I personally gave him like a few months, like a year, and then I was like, yeah, it's time to go in.
Right.
Because here's the thing, this is a man who called himself a feminist throughout his first mandate. I noticed he's starting to he's saying that less and less now. I realize.
Oh, yeah.
It must have been SNC when the whole thing blew open, and it was women of color who were marginalized in his cabinet.
Yeah.
So after that, plus blackface, you're not a feminist, okay? So if people think that I'll forget blackface, they're mistaken. But at the same time, on the right, my right,
I know
what are they right? I'm like this.
Like dance.
Yeah, on the right, they've been able to be powerhouses at organizing.
Yeah.
And organizing to the point where it's cross-border.
Mm-hmm.
And how did they get there? And how were they able to, because it seems like they harness digital media to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And what actual lessons can we learn from them in that way? Because they will say the most idiotic things you've ever heard that belie logic and science and established facts, and it will move through the discourse without much pushback. That's what's killing me. I'm just like, Andrew Scheer called himself a feminist. Andrew Scheer?
I know.
Really? This is where we're at? Anyway, Nora, go ahead.
You know what? Okay, so like we do have to recognize that, because the Conservatives are the party of corporate power, they're gonna have an easier ride, right? So that is an element of that. But the Liberals are also the party of corporate power too. So but the Conservatives are masters of organizing. Masters of organizing. So I like to tell this story, and maybe I've told it to you, maybe I haven't. You can pretend to be surprised if I have. I have, I've been to a couple political conventions in my life, not that many, thank God. But when I went to the Liberal Policy Convention a couple of years ago, the Ontario Liberal Party, it was stunning how they treated racialized people. Stunning. Like I saw it. Okay. Like it was obvious. Like racialized people held the door open. They served the food. They staffed the tables. The people in power were white. And it was that stark. And I don't remember who I was there with. I think I was there
How
with Sandy.
Southern plantation.
It was stunning. I think I was there with Sandy. It was in Ottawa, and I was like, you're like," and she's like, what is this? And so this is the Liberal Party. Okay. Then I went to the Conservative convention. I did not go with Sandy. This is why I was trying to remember who I was with. The Conservative convention was so diverse and so average people that you would see plaid and suits. You would see someone who looked poor. You would see obviously people who looked rich. Like it was average people. You heard lots of languages being spoken. It wasn't the racialized people holding the door open. It was very, very normal, right? It was very what you would expect to see at a political convention. It's the Ontario Conservative Party, or the Progressive Conservative Party. And I remember just being like I'm never shocked when I see that the Conservatives have organized. I'm never shocked when I see the Conservatives have managed to figure out how to talk to working class people, to racialized people. Like they are masters of this. And they do this because they understand that they can go into a space. They don't have to be invited to that space. They just walk into spaces and they make friends and they make promises and they listen. What is it that you are concerned by? Oh, you're concerned. That's our new issue. That's our new issue. That's our new issue. And they've perfected this big tent on the right to such an extent that their networks go deep through religious organizations, which of course crosses class and racial and regional boundaries. They go deep into the business world. They go deep into the remnants of like whatever exists of church ladies still. So there's this strong like woman kind of presence that's quiet, but you put a Christine Elliott at the front, they're like, yeah, Christine Elliott, right? She almost won, right? She only didn't win because Doug Ford was smarter than her and made an alliance with the anti-abortion, I don't remember, Tanya Allen Greenwich,
CLC is, I
the
believe.
Campaign Life Coalition.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. That's
exactly.
who is in the book. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, no, and so, but they treat difference in a very different way than the left does. It's kind of like, it's like Andrew Scheer's probably a raging racist. He doesn't care. He doesn't care. He doesn't care. He can't dance. You put him on a video of him dancing and he's like, him at Carabana, yeah, I can't dance. And everyone's like, you can't dance, man. And he's like, I don't care, right? And there's no left-wing equivalent to that, right? Like the networks that they have, and then the rallies they have, and the real life organizing, the support that they give to their ridings, the amount of power their ridings have in deciding things about the party. The NDP is nowhere compared to the Conservatives on this stuff. And so what are the lessons? The lessons are real life, like standing on top of a box talking to people at a gas station is still really important, because that's where people are. You go to malls, you go to religious spaces, you go to whatever, you go to these communities and you organize people. And the thing that is so frustrating is to see that the problem the left doesn't do this is because the left is oftentimes, when I say the left, okay, let's say I'm talking about the NDP. They're afraid of average people, right? They're afraid that they're going to get into a space and this space is going to say, you know what, you guys have to make education free. And they'll be like, yeah, that's our policy. We're going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
They have no plan to do that. That's not what they're going to do. There's no confidence that's built into these structures. And so the Conservatives will out-organize all the time because they're masters of it. And even if all the NDP was to mimic what the Conservatives are doing, I think you'd see a party that was much more powerful.
Oh, that's interesting, because usually what they will tell you is, well, we don't have the money the Conservatives do, so we can't do anything.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, I feel like you can.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like Jagmeet Singh, at the time he became leader and the time he became elected to Burnaby, should have been knocking on doors.
Yeah.
He should have had, like an abortion caravan, okay, the Scooby-Doo original truck caravanning across Canada and knocking on doors.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I feel like that's what he should have been doing.
It's
and collecting data. What's the problem? I don't understand. But I just don't understand how organizing on the left was left to the right. That was my thing.
Hmm.
And how feminist organizing kind of turned into the not-for-profit industrial complex, which is basically what you were talking about like in the book, about that complex. I'm just gonna say one more thing before we go to questions. So this is what I wrote down. The work of women's groups became more and more professionalized, as you said in the book. We see a greater stratification in these sort of not-for-profit, government-funded places that don't do activism work because they are too afraid to open their mouths against power. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
And so, but the inner workings of their structure is Black, South Asian, and trans people do a lot of the heavy lifting and the frontline work. While the executive directors, who are mostly white, who are almost always white, get to have greater visibility and interface with power more.
Yes.
So you have this really odd tension. And I've heard this from workers who have worked in essential frontline service workers. The power structure, even within those places, which have now come to represent what feminism is supposed to do, is also, I think, just a big problem. And social services are easily co-opted by politicians. We're seeing it in Ottawa with there seems to be this push-pull between radical organizers and the police chief
Right.
slowly, and in between are social services, and guess where they're going to go?
Yeah.
To power, right? Because to them, power is an umbrella for them not to be defunded.
Yeah.
And so, which to me, I'm just like, they're going to defund you anyway, just for what you represent. So you're not saving anything. But that is the sort of those are the incentives that I guess neoliberalism and the hollowing out of funding. And how important is it to raise funds, or to learn to raise funds?
Oh, it's so critical. I mean, this is a real problem. It really is. The not-for-profit industrial complex is such an insidious force on the left, because then these organizations do everything possible to maintain their existence, rather than do everything possible to make sure that they're going out and seeking new members or whatever. And you can see this over and over and over. And so this is a tenet of neoliberalism, right? Neoliberalism took money out of people's individual abilities to donate more money or to donate their time, and gave like the one of the most important roles of the state is to then fund the projects that the state determines is important to fund, right? Like, how messed up is that? And so there's good reason that people become afraid that they're going to lose their funding. You said earlier that a lot of the future, or a lot of the kind of services that we need to imagine, are services that the community makes ourselves. And I think that the reality, I agree with that. And I think that the reality is that there's been an incredible swing from the days of the 1970s, where childcare centers and shelters and really what formed the basis of the feminist movement. They were community built. That these were people coming together and saying, the state's not doing it for us, so we're doing it for ourselves. And then naturally you look at, like, this childcare center, this childcare center, this childcare center, you're like, no, the state has to do this. This doesn't make sense for individuals to take on, because it's not
Right.
equitable, right? You can't do that across an entire whatever. But there's a limit to that, right? We still don't have a childcare system anywhere in Canada, with the exception of Quebec. And Quebec was only possible because of the militancy of the Quebec feminist movement, and quite frankly, the courage of Pauline Marois, who is also a raging racist. We must be honest, right? So that's a really difficult place to be put in, because you're right. These structures then have people, like, there's a generational clash. There's white supremacy in a lot of these organizations, and so you've got white leadership who've been there for many years. And
they're usually older. Yeah.
Right. And they might understand or they might not understand. And no number of paid consultants is going to get them to understand. And the limited resources makes the stakes even higher, because it means that if you can't get a job here, you can't get a job anywhere, because the jobs just don't exist anymore.
Mhm.
And so it becomes a toxic location to do for struggle. And so for people who are involved in not-for-profit organizations, and who are white, if you're watching, here's my advice. Look at your board. If your board is all white or mostly white, that is a problem, and you have no excuse for it, period. And I
Mhm.
know how easy it is to be like, oh, but this person's so great, we couldn't find anybody who was racialized in Saskatchewan. It's like, you're not looking hard enough. And
Or
some
you're not plugged into the right communities.
Exactly. And so, sometimes you got someone who's super great and wants to be on your board, and you're like, you know what, we really can't have another white person. um Hopefully keep volunteering, and we're gonna search for someone else, and making
Yeah.
sure that we're actually creating structures that exist within these structures. I mean, I don't think the board structure is ideal, but if you that's what you got, that's what you got. You have to diversify these structures, and then you have to listen to the staff that you employ. And if the staff you employ are like, it's pretty racist around here, you don't fire them if they've said that on the internet, which we know is happening.
Hello, equal voice.
Right?
It,
Like,
it irritates me that equal voice keeps getting funded. Anyway.
well, of course they will, right? Because they are not threatening. It's not threatening to power to say we want all people to have equal voice, right?
Yeah.
What's threatening to power is to actually say, wait a minute, when Black women get elected in this country, this is what happens. And whose
Mhm.
fault is that? Oh, it goes to the top. Okay,
Mhm.
so how do we undo that? Oh, then we have to attack the top, right? Oh, the top
Mhm.
doesn't like that. And then you get people like Marian Montseff, whose entire life has been within this industrial complex, and is happy to just give as much money to these organizations as possible, and which is really important, and then to get rid of their own responsibility to deal with this stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, we gave $5 million to the YWCA. We don't have to deal with that. It's like,
Yeah.
what the hell? That's not how this works. But again, you need to have really strong, radical social movement actors who are saying, no, 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 this is not going to pass. No, no, it does not make sense for the Ministry of Gender of gender equity, or whatever the heck it's called now. My God, it's like I'm already into my next book, so
It's
I'm like,
called wage, women,
wage, yeah, and gender equity.
equity, equality. I don't know, something like that. Yes. Okay.
But I'll just finish this. It doesn't make sense to be like, oh, we're going to pour money to them to give them data collection
Yeah.
power. Stats can. There's a stats
I
can.
know.
There's just these kind of little minor liberally schemy things that we really need to.
Yeah, no, because guess what? Like StatsCan is used by everybody. So like it's supposed to be a public service. Anyway,
Yeah.
I have two questions. One from Suzanne Marshall. I'd love to hear more about toxic individualism and the way it affects women and women's concerns, especially around parenting, social space, responsibility, etc.
Whoa. Okay. Yeah. So toxic individualism. So this is kind of what has replaced the feminist movement in a lot of the English-speaking world. And by English-speaking world, I'm thinking United States, Canada, like on the English-speaking social media, let's say, because that's the social media that I follow the French social media as well. But anyway, and what social media has kind of created this space where people can just declare themselves the leader of some sort of feminist movement, right? And they might become the leader because they called a rally, right? Or they might become a leader because they had a hashtag that went viral. And sometimes the person that does it is a long-time feminist, and they're great and they have a movement behind them, but oftentimes they do not. And so social media, we're always speaking through a mitigating platform, and a platform that is making money off of us. And so every single thing we put out into the world, even this conversation right here, is being mitigated by Zoom, which is making money off of the fact that we're doing this through Zoom. And so we always have to keep that in mind. And so it's like you've got a society and you've got a sieve, and the social media is the sieve, and we all come out in individual little specks, and social media needs to amplify some number of people among those specks to be able to keep other people from coming back, to be able to keep other people to keep coming back. And so that creates this individualized celebrity around feminism, where you've got these individual feminist celebrities who may or may not be shitty, who may or may not be smart, may or may not be plugged in, may or may not be doing the work. We don't know, because it doesn't matter, because they are saying the right words, tweeting enough, having the best Instagram posts or whatever. And the problem with that is then we get confused into the idea that that then becomes a movement on its own, that we can do that kind of work in real life. When you have an individual who starts to become like shitty, and you have a movement of people, the ideal is the people around that person can go, hey, we should have a conversation about this, right? Like there's actually ways to intervene, and that you can sit down and you can find out what's going on or whatever. But
That's the accountability structure you were talking about earlier. Yeah.
And in absence of that, like people lash out and then become even more toxic because there's no real way to be human on these platforms. So it's a real tenet of the digital age, I think, because I don't think you could get away with being like all the time shitty in the same way before we had the internet.
So how do we build the community we need in the digital age, as Jessica asks?
That's the big question, right? So what we need is that we need to make sure that we have physical real life spaces where people are getting together, where you're not talking through the screens all the time, and really important that those spaces are accessible, like accessible in every way, physically accessible, financially accessible, accessible by time, accessible for childcare, but that they also cross regions so that people can meet each other, not just in their individual communities, but that they can come together across the province, they can come together across Canada. And in these meetings, you start to actually build the relationships necessary to then continue online in the periods of time that you don't see one another.
Right.
That's a really, really important thing. And it's not that radical. Like, right. We've got this childcare fight. I just wrote this article for Chatelaine saying this. This could be the moment that people are like, you know what? We're going to create a one-time coalition. Organizations that have fought for childcare forever are going to call a one-time coalition. They want every organization possible to join. Here's the statement of principles that you have to agree to join. There's going to be a masked council of decision makers, and you get a spot on it as if you're an individual versus an organization. Everybody's involved. And we're going to have national and provincial discussions in person. And who funds that? Then you look at labor. Then you look at the creative ways that the not-for-profit world, you have the kind of money to send people to finance things, to subsidize things. Are the people who actually have the money to do it themselves? There will be people that have the money to do it themselves. This is the slow work of the structure of organizing that is really difficult to know if you've never seen it. But like, I think a lot to this part in the book of the first meeting of the National Council of Women in the 1886 or something. And they had a national meeting. It's like, how the hell did you people travel across Canada?
Yeah.
They figured it out in 1886. We can do it today. And
Yeah.
do not tell me that the answer is Zoom. Like, Zoom plays a role, but we still need to get together in real life to have these discussions, and critically to meet each other and to figure out who in the room is the cop.
Well, on that note, Nora, so I'm gonna just hold up Nora's book again. This was awesome and amazing, and I can't wait till you come on the Bad and Bitchy podcast so we could talk a little bit more about this, and you can explain just a little bit more about what you mean. So, on behalf of Ottawa Writers Fest, thank you. This was great. I honestly wish we were doing this in person.
I know.
I do.
Then we just go out after. And
right? See, and then we would bond, and then we would build that relationship. Exactly. Yeah. So there's another answer to the question. Thank you, Ottawa Public Library, for your infrastructure and your stakeholderliness. And I think that's it. Is anybody coming in to talk besides me? I wonder. Anyway, you guys, independent bookstores buy this book. You don't know, what I do like about it also is that it's actually applicable to a lot of things in our lives, and just organizing people in general. It's really good for that. So thank you for writing something that is absolutely engaging. Because I literally read this like in 2 days.
I'm so glad, because there's a part in like chapter 6 where I was like, whoa, this is heavy. I don't know who's gonna get
Chapter 6 is the one. Yes, it is the one.
Yeah, and
That's the trigger warnings one.
yeah, exactly. Hence, like, why it's so heavy. I'll just make a plug. I have another book coming out in the fall, and it's on. I know, and I hope people can just pay attention for that. It's called Spin Doctors: How Politicians and Media Misdiagnose the COVID-19 Pandemic.
Okay, so that's one part that I would have liked another chapter on media.
Oh,
That's
there's
what
a chapter
because
on
because you're like, that's like your specialty, right? And yes, you do talk about journalists in between, but media in general. But yeah, so another book. Congrats.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you,
All right.
everybody. Thank you as well, also to the Ottawa Writers Fest and the Ottawa Public Library. I love it. Love you all.